Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back once again to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. We're not going to talk about what-if machines today. We lead too many episodes off that way. You know we have one. That's how we do the magic. That's the secret technology that drives A Fork in Time. Joined here by Alexis. Don sitting in the host chair today. How are we doing today, Lex?
Pretty good.
Today we're going to look at a historical what-if that is, I think, both powerful and subtle at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So, the United States, we sometimes refer to the United States, and we use this term, the contiguous United States. When we use the term contiguous, what do we mean by that, Alexis?
That would be the states that are connected.
And how many of those are there?
48.
All right. But the United States, as everyone knows, has 50 states. So one of those states is stuck out in the middle of the Pacific. That would be Hawaii. And then the 49th state, which literally was the 49th state also by its admission of the Union, is what state, Alexis?
That'd be Alaska.
Alaska. So today we're going to look at a historical what-if, and the historical what-if is going to be centered around what if Alaska were not part of the United States. And like I say, I think this is also one of those subtle what-ifs that it's like, until it's oh. And so we'll go down that path when we come back here from one of the folks that helps make the podcast possible. Hope you stick with us. Thanks. This is Don.
And Alexis.
Taking just a quick break from the podcast to tell you about something new that you'll find at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Boy, we push that a lot, don't we, Lex?
Yeah.
So we've talked about the other things that are there, but this is something that is
brand new.
So what is the brand new thing, Lex?
We have merchandise now.
Merchandise, but we're a podcast. Why would we need merchandise?
Well, merchandise is a good way to tell people about the podcast.
So it's like promotional advertising for the podcast?
Yes.
So we're doing a little ad here about the fact that we now have things that will be an ad?
Basically, yes.
Okay, so it's a little bit of looking through the universal length of mirrors here. But we're excited about the fact that we've created a partnership or relationship with, the site is called TeePublic. And what's cool about TeePublic is, a lot of times when you do promotional materials, you have to pay like these setup fees, and you have to do a large number of whatever you're doing, a t-shirt, a mug, a cap, whatever it is. It just becomes, it involves money. And so we were looking for a way, and I became familiar with TeePublic as a result of another podcast using them. And so it's a way to do promotional items or logoed items really effectively. So Lex, what are some of the options that exist there?
We can get things like a t-shirt, a hoodie, a coffee mug. That's a big thing for me. So tons of different options.
Yeah, and right now what we have there is the primary logo that you're most familiar with through your podcatcher. It's the A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast logo with our split arrows. I call it the split arrows in my head. I don't know if that's a term that Alexis uses, but when I think about the logo, it's the split arrows. So it's that logo that you're familiar with, and you can get it on any of those items. So you can find the link there off of our website that will carry you over to the TeePublic site. By the way, at TeePublic, there's all kinds of designers who have their things there. So we're just taking advantage of their platform with our logo. And so they're the ones who will then print the shirt, make the mug, pillows, there's all kind, totes, cell phone case covers are actually one of the things. So lots of different things there. Right now it's just the one logo, although Alexis and I have been talking about some of the other things that we'll add, so we'll invite you to come back. But what we invite you to do is rep the show. And you can rep the show by getting some of the logoed items that are available there on TeePublic, and you can find the link to that through our site. Anything else you want to say about that, Lex?
Go buy something.
Tell
people about the podcast.
Yeah. We'd appreciate it. So appreciate you being a listener and joining, and we'll go back to the podcast now. Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the cold Alaska edition. As we were talking about a little bit before the break, today we're going to look at the historical what if of what if the territory, which eventually became the state of Alaska, were not part of the United States. And as I mentioned sort of in the intro, I think this is one of those subtle kind of things that for a lot of it you say, yeah, it doesn't make much of a difference until it actually does make a difference. And so, as we often do here on A Fork in Time, we actually go into the process of talking normally about the historical what did before we start talking about the historical what if. So, Lex, I'm just going to ask you, what do you know about the United States acquiring Alaska?
Not a lot, although I do know who we acquired it from.
Who did we acquire it from?
That'd be Russia.
From Russia. And again, some of us who were born in the middle of the 20th century suffer from this fact of those of us that were working on being correct worked so hard at talking about the Soviet Union.
Right. I don't even know if I called it the right name at that point. I don't think I did.
You did. They actually are Russia when we bought it from them. But I sometimes have this problem of when I hear Russia, I think, no, Soviet Union. This actually was Russia. And it's interesting because the when you think about how much territory the United States came into possession of, in fact, it's an interesting exercise to look at for any nation, how the territory that comprises them comes to be. So the United States is not unique in that respect. But the United States comes as a result of a number of different things, but two of the largest components of how the United States grew were not because it was conquered, was not because it was part of the original revolution and thus territory that came into being. It comes as a result of doing what?
Purchasing it.
Yeah, you can do this thing with land called buying it.
Yeah.
And while we typically think of maybe that being something that individuals do, it's been not uncommon throughout history for there to be this situation where nations have sold or ceded territory in exchange for financial gain. And so the two big, large parts of the United States that came into being this way, of course, the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which doubled the size of the United States at the time. That was the U.S. buying that territory from France, who, see concepts from other episodes. France needed money to fight a war, had land, needed money, willing to sell land for
very cheap
for money, yeah, especially per acre or per unit. But then the other purchase that from the size of territory is equally as impressive as the U.S. purchase of the territory that had been occupied by Russia in, I guess they began to really first starting settling there in the 17th century, but it's the territory that we know today as Alaska. It was actually purchased by the United States from Russia. The effort was led by then the Secretary of State, who was William Seward, who is well known. In fact, it's sort of interesting because the term that was described for Alaska for so much time was what?
This.
What is that?
Seward's Folly.
Seward's Folly. Why in the world would we want to go and buy this large chunk of
ice
/ wilderness in the extreme northwestern point of the continent when at that time, still to a great degree, while the United States had expanded or its territories had expanded further west, California was already a state by this time, for example. The United States was still very much an eastern North American nation in terms of its population and its distribution. We were going to go buy this territory way up in the northwest. So, the reasons for buying it are interesting, but today we're going to talk about the scenario more, not the historical what did, but the historical what if, which is what if it had not been acquired by the United States. But as always, we sort of have to go down the what did path. So when I say Alaska, Lex, and thinking about it from a United States perspective, what do you think of as being the biggest benefits of the United States having Alaska?
Oil.
Oil. There's oil under that there tundra or under those offshore waters.
Mm-hmm. Lots of it.
Lots of it. In fact, so much so that they built this big pipeline to transport it from the northern side of the state to the southern side of the state, where the port actually can exist near Anchorage. There, we've been there before, so I can imagine that. Been up for part of that. What else do you think of when you think of Alaska?
I think of wildlife, and specifically I think of salmon. There's lots of salmon that can be useful for trading and commerce.
Yeah, in fact, one of the interesting things, I guess that was in 2014, We
I
took
know because I just found the photos on the computer I'm borrowing.
Yeah, we took a family cruise to Alaska, and along the way up, as we were moving through the parts of Alaska that hug the Pacific coast, sort of the thing that extends down out of the big part of Alaska, where you find many of the settlements there in the ports of call, places like Ketchikan and uh,
Okay.
Skagway and Juneau and the other ports that we saw there, you do very much see the influence of the salmon. I particularly think about Ketchikan there, where there's a salmon ladder type of thing that goes up. But you very much do think about natural resources, so hunting and fishing and the things that were there. And in fact, that's what first attracted the Russians
Yep.
to go to Alaska, was that they discovered these were good territories for primarily for their fishing interests. And for the most part, while there is the very large, vast interior spaces of Alaska, most of the settlement by Russia and then by the United States has been along the
Coast.
coast. The other big thing that I think of when I think of Alaska, this was the other big thing that caused, to the extent that Alaska had some booms in previous times, before oil was found there and the resource of oil, was gold. So there was the Alaska gold rush.
Yeah, it didn't just stop in California. It went further north.
Right. And so, in fact, it's, I guess after the California gold rush, it's later in the 19th century that we have the discovery of gold. And so some of the, in fact, many of those small little towns sometimes seem a little bit strong to describe what they are.
Settlements.
Settlements, they're villages even today that are primarily driven by tourism, with the exception of Juneau, which is a larger city. Were the result of one of two things: either the fishing interest, as you mentioned there, or the mining interest before the discovery of oil. So ultimately, we have a situation today where the United States, of course, possesses Alaska, what is a territory, eventually gains statehood admission. So it's one of the two states that's not part of the contiguous United States. And so it's there now. But the different scenario would have been there was the period of time that it was absolutely under Russian control.
Mm-hmm.
And so they had established this particular territory. And again, it was sparsely populated by the Russians. So as we go down this historical what are some of the questions that, because I sort of sprung this topic on you, Lex, so I know you don't come to this topic as prepared. What are some of the questions that might just be running through your head, they might be running through a listener's head coming to this first time? What are some of the things you might think about asking when it comes to what if Russia still controlled Alaska?
Well, I think, and we were kind of talking about this a little bit off podcast, is yes, Alaska is part of the United States now. It's still very, very close to Russia, few miles in certain instances. So it it immediately springs to my mind of what would kind of the makeup of those settlements be if you still had Russia being in control of what we think of as the modern state of Alaska, because they are so geographically close together. So it's almost like Alaska is just an extension. It's almost like another, even though it's attached to Canada, it's not an island in the same way as Hawaii is, but it's almost just a little. It's an island off the coast of Russia. It's so close. So one of the immediate things that pops into my mind is what would the makeup of these villages or settlements be if it was still in the hands of Russia.
Yeah, in fact, some of the things that are there, it's actually, I think, not one of the small cities that we went to. It wasn't one of our ports of call, but you still have Russian influence in terms of architecture and some of the other things that were there, because these were originally Russian fishing villages or settlements prior to the sale to the United States. So I agree. One of the things that immediately pops to head is the idea of just how things would have been different in terms of what would have been there. The premise that I'm going to take here in terms of this what if is the realization that what you first mentioned, which is that while it may seem somewhat, nobody was particularly, the reason the Russians were willing to sell it was that it was not directly connected to the continent, to Asia, that they were on it. It was nearby and certainly within distance that are there. In fact, across that small peninsula up there, the Aleutians, then across the peninsula there, that's where the international dateline falls. And in fact, we were watching something that related to the fact that there's this island that's sort of split between Russian and American control, and during the winter, you literally could sort of walk
Walk.
across time because you could walk across the date line.
And to a different country.
Right, in the process that's there. But the realization is that while it may not have seemed like a big thing in the middle of the 19th century when the sale takes place, and even moving forward, okay, yeah, there is the gold rush, and maybe that would have, changed. There would have been Russian influence into the territory, although there's no doubt that others other than Russians would have come, just as Americans went to this territory that was there as well. But the very fact that the discovery of oil there would change the dynamic tremendously.
Right.
And so I'm going to look at this from two different perspectives. One perspective is what would have happened if the Russia and then later the Soviet Union as we know it had possessed this territory. So now imagine under that scenario, the first scenario that we'll look at, imagine a Cold War where the divisions between the United States and the Soviet Union are, yeah, not just across some of the water that separates the very easternmost tips of Asia from the area that's Alaska today, but imagine that there was actually Soviet territory on
The North American continent.
North American continent.
That's not a Cold War.
Well, that's actually sort of what the point. What the point is. Interesting enough, we're talking about the cold part of the continent, but the realization, if you think back through particularly the history of the Cold War, the history of how things progressed moving forward, is that the United States was very concerned, for example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, about missiles being where? In
Cuba.
Cuba. Why?
Proximity.
Proximity. The fact that meant that shorter range, less warning, as we moved into the missile age, or even bombers, other military assets, but particularly during the nuclear age, would have been much easier to deliver because they were much closer to the United States. Now imagine the scenario where, and again, we're just going to assume for this purposes that we're talking about the same border roughly that exists today for Alaska. You would have a border where Alaska doesn't directly border the United States.
Correct.
Who would it border?
Canada.
It would border Canada, our neighbor to the north and our ally to the north, but they would very much have this large foothold on the North American continent. So now imagine, if you will, the period of the Cold War where there's a Soviet presence on the North American continent. So do you have to put missiles in Cuba?
No.
Do you have to house naval resources in port cities that are along the Kamchatka Peninsula and other places in Asia? No. Where do you have them?
In Alaska.
Yeah, places like Anchorage, maybe places like Juneau. And certainly you can have the missiles and the bomber bases, the types of military assets that would have been important. You can have them much closer to the United States and much closer to Canada. And so it's, one of the historical what if scenarios to imagine here is what would it have been like to go into the Cold War period once we were no longer allied with the Soviets after World War II and we grew into the situation of the Cold War, where you have their territory, their possession on the North American continent. Any thoughts about that, Lex?
Again, that's not a Cold War. The reason we're able to kind of call it a Cold War is because we have that physical distance. I mean, yes, they were allied with Cuba, which is very, very close to the southern United States, but because we have that, there's this kind of this waiting game and this kind of, will they, won't they, we're just kind of propagate it. But if Russia is able to have tanks and aircraft and things and missiles on the American continent, that's not a Cold War. And I think while maybe necessarily Russia wouldn't have been the aggressor in that instance, maybe they just would have had them to hold them there, military bases and things like that. I don't think the United States would have taken very kindly to that, because it's like, but you got them really close to us, and we're going to attack you before you have the chance to attack us. So again, that's not a Cold War.
Yeah. One of the things that pops into my mind in terms of changing if you will, this is about geography. We've changed the geography, and thus we've changed the politics.
Right.
This is why it's called geopolitics.
Right.
Is that when we typically thought of Soviet aggression, we being the United States, looking at it from a Western/NATO perspective, the concern was, in some reason rightly so, because of what the history had been, would be how things would play out in Europe. So you have NATO, the North American Treaty Organization, you had the Warsaw Pact, and there were all types of scenarios where, World War III scenarios, if you will, or other conflict scenarios would break out in Europe.
Right.
Europe would be and certainly there were proxy wars without a doubt fought during the Cold War in places like Korea and
No.
Vietnam and the other in the 80s we're talking about here now Nicaragua and El Salvador and of course situations with Cuba. All of that existed, but for the most part, the tensions that existed between the United States and the Soviet Union, while global in respects, no doubt, were more focused along Europe.
Right.
And so, for example, a large U.S. military contingent was kept in Europe as part of NATO as a deterrent to Soviet bloc Warsaw Pact forces. Well, would you have been able to have manned and stationed as many U.S. troops in Europe if, in fact, you had a much closer to home threat that
Right.
existed in a Russian/Soviet controlled Alaska?
I don't think so. It's like, we're not going to send our troops over there. We've got to defend here.
Yeah. And so, one of the things I think that you would have definitely seen under that scenario, again, assuming that you still have the rise of the Cold War tensions just by changing where Russia and then ultimately the Soviet Union exist on the map, is that you would have had a much larger United States military presence that would have stayed domestic.
Mm-hmm.
That's a defensive stance because it would have needed to stay domestic, and you would have seen a larger number perhaps of U.S. or joint bases that were built in Canada,
Mm-hmm.
which housed forces, with the theory being to prevent possible Soviet aggression on the North American continent. So not just the positioning of Soviet missiles in Soviet Alaska, but also positioning U.S. or changing the dynamic of where U.S. land forces, air forces, other military forces would be deployed. For example, I think you would see a much larger presence of the United States fleet, which already has a Pacific fleet presence. That Pacific fleet presence, yes, would have probably still been heavily based out of Hawaii, but it would have also been a lot more out of Seattle and Portland and places that were closer to where the threat was actually perceived to be.
Right.
So that's the first thing that pops into mind. Can you think of anything else that would have changed maybe from the Cold War perspective, Lex?
Not really.
Yeah. I do think the other thing for me that pops in there is what would have been the relationship between the United States and Canada. In the Cold War sense, the Canadians are part of the Western defense, they're part of NATO, they're part of all of that.
They're
But
also part of the Commonwealth.
right, which makes them part of that. But would the situation be that we would have a much stronger, maybe some form of two-party military alliance that exists between the United States and Canada because of the Canadian fears about what would happen with Soviet aggression?
I think I could definitely see that. And it would not really be Canada necessarily coming to our defense. It would be more of protecting themselves. Because those missiles and those tanks and those things, they have to come through Canada to get to the United States and to attack the United States. So I think you would have seen this allying of Canadian troops and American troops simply because Canada is trying to protect itself because it sits in the middle of these two nations that are at war.
Right. And so I think you would see two things that result from that. I think you would see a more militarized Canada
Mm-hmm.
in terms of building up their own military defense forces. They share that long border
Yes.
in this scenario with the Soviets, not the United States, although the United States would feel responsible and threatened by it. So there's that aspect that's going on, but I also think you would see much closer cooperation military between the United States and Canada as part of that defense. So that'd be one of the things that would change there. Then there's the whole other aspect, which is the oil aspect.
Mm-hmm.
So when is discovery of oil in Alaska really doesn't happen until the later 60s. The Prudhoe Bay discovery, I think, is in 67 or 68, if my memory serves. And then the building, very quickly, you actually have the pipeline that's built to bring the oil from there. But this was a very substantial oil find. Alaska still has a lot that's there. It's also very difficult to extract that oil and to transport that oil.
Correct.
So, one of the things, though, that we know historically has been a driving force, particularly in the 20th century for the Soviet force, was needing access to oil reserves. And so, having these reserves on their own territory in Alaska and being able to, we're going to assume that it's still called Alaska. We don't know what the Russians slash then later the Soviets would have called it. How they would have then probably invested in the technology and the things that were necessary for the extraction in such a way. And so they definitely would have benefited from having the resources that were there, but they also would have had to work on the technology and the other things that were important to making that happen.
Right.
This is something that Soviets have, and later the Russians have done, even moving forward in the 21st century, is extracting oil from challenging places like the Kara Sea and other places like that. So it'd be interesting to see that through. But the very existence of those oil reserves, even if the Russians, then later the Soviets come to the conclusion, well, it's not worth maintaining this territory over in North America, so maybe we'll do something else. Suddenly there would have been a reason to maintain it, which were the oil interests.
Correct.
And I think that would have changed, again, the geopolitics and the economics of geopolitics all over again. The other interesting twist I want to take on this what if was actually explored. I actually saw a YouTube video, on this. I think it was on Alternate History Hub, so I'll give them credit because I think it actually came from there, which is they raised this as a topic. I may put a link to that video in the show notes. So again, giving credit where credit is due, not to plagiarize here, but the inspirations in alternate history can come from other sources. One of the ideas that comes to mind there is what would have happened. I've been assuming that we still have the same Russia, then become the Soviets because of the Russian Revolution in 1917. But what would have happened if the territory that we know of as Alaska today had been perhaps where maybe the Tsar and his family or some of the other pre-Soviet elements of Russia where they had gone into exile? So yes, there still is there still is a Russia. It's just not in Asia. The Russia now that exists in post-Soviet revolution is in Alaska.
That's a weird concept.
And I think that was actually what was raised in the video that I saw, which is why it's running through my head. Just want to address it here. I think that's another interesting way to think about it. Is that imagine, if you will, at that particular time in 1917, yeah, there's gold, but there's not a lot of gold. That was already worked out. And this is pre the discovery of oil, so yeah, you know what? You can go and have that territory over there in North America if you'll just go away quietly, Nicholas and family. So I know I just sprung that on you, Lex, but what sort of runs through your head on that?
That is very, very interesting. And the first thing, honestly, that popped in my head when you were talking is Alaska is very big, but it's, as we've talked about, it's not very habitable, particularly in the interior. Mainly you're living on the outskirts. The problem is Russia is very, 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 very big. It's so big that I tend to think of it as a European country. Technically, it's a European and an Asian country because it's so big. So if you have the Russian imperial family kind of put in exile in Alaska, like, go live there. There's not really anything happening over there. You can have it. It's fine. But then, again, the benefit of hindsight of then you have the Russian royal family discovering oil. Are they able to, with the oil and with the discovery of that oil and with the money that comes from that discovery of that oil, are they able to engender a counter-revolution and take back I got so excited I hit the microphone. Take back their throne in mainland Russia because they have the capital to fund that with the discovery of oil in Alaska.
Yeah, one of the big questions that plays into that, and I think it's an interesting question to ask, is when is the recognition that there's oil in Alaska? Because again, because it's under American control, and there's plenty of other oil resources in the United States, and then also they can be imported from other parts of the world. So there's not as much of a need or a desire to, that's what I'm looking for here. The oil that's there in Alaska is expensive to extract. In fact, it's only because of concerns about dwindling supplies globally that you even have the discoveries of it, and then the efforts that are made to extract it. Then, for example, building a pipeline. Once you've extracted it, now you have to transport it, and the difficulties that are associated with that. So I think the answer to your question really depends on when is there the realization that there is oil, and when does it actually become possible to exploit that. And I think that's not easily answered. Either one of those parts of the question are not easily answered. I don't think it's likely that there's the realization that there's the large reserves of oil because the technology involved in understanding that until before when it happened. So it probably is still not until the 60s and 70s. But so under this scenario again, just playing that what if, and again I think I borrowed this from Alternate History Hub, so I will give full credit there. And if not, I'll make sure I put in the show notes where I think I borrowed it from because I'll be able to find that YouTube video. Is imagine the scenario where, the Russian royal family goes over there. It's sort of this quaint little thing that the Russian royal family lives in this ice box that is the frozen north with their little, whatever they would call it, Russian America. Maybe they call it Russia because it's whatever it's called. Nicholas Land, I don't know, Tsarland, whatever it's called. So imagine that they just live this sleepy existence from the late second decade of the 20th century, from 1917 through until the 1960s and 1970s, when suddenly oil. And then you slide into the economic crisis, the oil situations of the 1970s, where the oil, which was already valuable, becomes incredibly valuable.
Right.
And so there, you have a scenario where, okay, for 50 or 60 years, we're happy to have them living in exile. I don't know, maybe, it becomes a tourist, maybe they survive as a tourist destination, with Russian Alaska. But then suddenly once they come into oil, perhaps later in the 1960s, 1970s, and the timing of that, they probably don't have the resources, obviously, to take on the entire Soviet Union. So recapturing their position, but they have a position to be somewhat influential in a lot of other ways. So maybe that's with trade with the United States. Maybe there's not as much of the concern about Middle Eastern oil in the 1970s because there's oil up in Alaska, and the Tsar's great grandson, whatever his name, let's make him Nicholas. Fill in a number here, Nicholas the Fourth maybe, or something like that, is more than willing to sell oil. But basically you have this idea, the image that I have in my head is this really cold Russian sultanate kind of thing, almost like thinking of the Middle East, this territory that becomes very oil rich very quickly, and how that changes the politics.
Yeah, and the other thing that keeps popping in my head, we've talked about it before, multiple times, is yes, the Russian royal family is kind of isolated, but they're also related by blood to several other European royal families. The most prevalent of those being the British royal family. So while they might not necessarily have had the means or the resources to mine that oil, if we get to the 1960s, 70s, the bloodline has not been taken out. They've probably been able to marry and further the bloodline, because we do have that. Ousted aristocratic families are still, marrying and having children, even though they might not necessarily have a throne or power to sit on. So if they can kind of wait it out from, 1917 to the 1960s to 1970s, now we have a new generation of Russian royalty that is still related to these other countries in Europe. Now we're finding this oil. Is it Britain that comes over and says, well, we'll help you mine that oil. We have, the money and the capital behind it to extract that oil, or we can develop the technology to extract that oil. So that's another interesting concept to me, of if they can just kind of wait it out for these, 50, 60 years, then they can potentially become a major player. And I like the kind of concept of like almost a sultanate, where it's like, we have all the power because we have all the oil.
Yeah, and in fact, there are examples of how oil discoveries, particularly in the recent, let's say, 50 years, can alter things. I particularly am very familiar with Norway, for example, which has the benefit of the oil that's extracted from the North Sea. Norway, prior to the discoveries and the ability to extract oil from the North Sea, is, they have beautiful fjords. They have a fishing economy. There's lots of things that are positive about Norway, and that are notable there. But it changes their position on the economic world stage once they have oil resources. I mean, for example, Norway has one of the largest national sovereign funds because of the money that flows from the North Sea oil. That changes the politics, the standard of living in the country. Again, I happen to know it very well because I'm connected to my organization. The organization I work for is connected to being based in that country, so I know Norwegians. I can call some Norwegians friends. Is that I know that population of 5 million Norwegians, the whole population of the whole country, about the size of the population of the city of Houston, for example, that oil revenue spread across that number of citizens makes for a pretty nice way of life in terms of what they're able to afford and the lifestyle they're able to have. The reason I draw that as an example is think about how sparsely populated Alaska is, and think about today, even the fact that there's revenue that's paid out to Alaska residents every year from the oil reserves, and how that's a fairly per capita, that's a fairly substantial portion of money. Now, my assumption would be in this, czar-controlled Alaska, Russia, is that you would have more citizens than we have in Alaska today, because there would have been folks who moved there, immigrated there over a period of time. But it's probably not an extremely large population because the territory just doesn't support.
It can't support it, yeah.
Right. And so suddenly having this influx of capital, money in the form of oil, changes their situation quite dramatically. And as a result of that, again, the per capita benefit, maybe it's, maybe they are more like, maybe they're the Western Hemisphere equivalent of a Norway or some of the other oil finds that happen particularly there. But I remember seeing this topic teased at one point. I think, I'm going to give for the third time, I think, what is the proper attribution here, which is the alternate history hub, about this concept of what would have happened if it hadn't just been in Soviet hands. We talked about what that could have meant, but if it actually had been in just a different form of
Russian hands,
and how that ultimately would play out. And again, when I first asked you, again, this was a fairly sprung upon you type of topic, so you didn't have a chance to do a lot of research, which sometimes is good because it allows you to sort of think it through as you go. Is that the first thing you thought about when I talked about Alaskan natural resources was oil, because it's probably the most valuable, other than just the sheer natural beauty of the territory. It's probably the number one economic resource that exists today.
Mm-hmm.
So you sort of talked about this scenario with the connections back of the Russian royal family to everybody in Europe. They're they're all related to everybody, right?
Yeah, they're all cousins somehow.
And so what impact does that potentially, if you think about it, you mentioned the United Kingdom and the close ties that exist there. The other nations that would have been close to Nicholas would have been whom historically?
The one that immediately pops to mind is Denmark. He was related, I think, doubly cousins, but also in-laws as well. So Denmark would have been, and Denmark is another one of those that is connected to the North Sea, things like that. So Denmark, Sweden, Spain. It's all because of Queen Victoria. Pretty much any child Queen Victoria has, their husband, their spouse is somehow related to a royal family of Europe. So we've got Russia somehow connected to the United Kingdom, of course, but then we've got Spain, we've got Sweden, we've got Denmark, and we've got Russia, all connected to each other. So I think if you have that's almost a treaty in and of itself, just by family relations, to kind of bolster this little exiled section of Russia that's living in what we know as Alaska.
Right. Again, this is sort of a different type of historical what if, but I think the initial thing, how important is Alaska to the United States? Well, it's important for the reasons that it is important, but for most of history, it's sort of whatever, until it becomes not a
whatever.
Right, and then it becomes incredibly valuable for the reasons that are there. So I think under both scenarios, if you will, Soviet Alaska, which was the first what if that we looked at, and then this idea of an alternate Russian Alaska, makes for an interesting thing. The other thing that popped into my mind is also, again, just thinking about how things, move throughout history. Certainly one of the concerns during World War II, in fact, we saw this during the Battle of Midway, is that a diversion was launched by sending part of the Japanese fleet against sites in the Aleutians,
Yep.
the islands that were there. So this idea of the United States needing to defend that extended territory of Alaska, altered in some ways the course of World War II and the things that happened with that. And so there's even that aspect of things which, just are interesting to think of in the back of your mind. Would, how would that have been different in a situation where there was no need to defend that?
Right.
Where the thoughts would have been along defending the the west coast of the United States, and assuming Hawaii is still a state. The other thing that I think was that I thought there was the idea of this concept, particularly going back to the Cold War version of this idea of assuming Canada is our strong ally and standing and defending, we're working with them to defend against this Soviet possession of parts of North America, is that puts the situation where, well, it's only a little trek through Western Canada, which is sparsely populated, for Soviet agents to infiltrate into the Northwest
United
States. And so, one of the things that immediately jumps to my mind there, having been to both British Columbia, having been to Washington State, having been to Alaska, those territories might be far more urbanized, might be far more built up. This idea of just leaving it as open wilderness in quite the way we enjoy it now might not have been an option if you were dealing with a border that needed to be
protected
and defended. So, I think it's probably very likely the case that in certainly the far northern parts of Alaska, you can easily slide over into Canada and not even realize you've done it because there's nobody really
there
up there. That would certainly not be the case if we were dealing with this idea of Soviet Alaska. All right. I don't think I have anything else on this. Do you have anything else, Lex?
I don't think so. Yeah, as you mentioned at the top of the show, this is one of those things that it's like meh until you think about it and you're like, oh. It's a little thing, but when you expand it out, it becomes big.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of things that are like that, and we can close out on this idea of the small territorial changes. We mentioned Cuba earlier. Cuba ultimately became its own independent nation, but it came into under U.S. control as a result of the Spanish-American War. There was a lot of emphasis and expectation at that time, thinking about should the United States annex Cuba, making it. I mean, we did annex Puerto Rico. We chose not to annex Cuba. The Philippines came under U.S. domination. We chose to let them go a different direction. But there's these small things, and you can do it, and we will do it at some point. This is a topic I know I do want to cover. Is what would have happened if Cuba had been annexed? That has a huge impact on 20th century history for the United States in the sense of all the things that it has an impact on. If there's a Cuban Missile Crisis, it's an entirely different animal if you have it under that scenario, for example, or what would have happened as a result. All right, again, thank you for joining us here on A Fork in Time today. We sort of do this at the end of every episode, so we won't emphasize it hard here, but certainly do encourage you to visit our website. Alexis, where will they find us on the web?
That is aforkintimepodcast.com.
Yeah, so go there. You'll see the opportunity. We suggest that you go there for the ability to give us feedback, topical suggestions, access to our links for social media, the back catalog of podcasts, ways that you can support the show both financially and through non-financial means that are there. And as we've mentioned on a couple of episodes here, we now have merchandise that's there. So if you're interested in getting something that bears the A Fork in Time logo, we've set up a relationship that allows you to do that, and so you'll find that on the web. So that's just where you can go and find out more about the show. If you're a new listener, we encourage you to do that. We actually did hit something of a notable mark over the latter part of 2020. The metric that is used by our podcasting host to estimate our listeners. We hit a milestone. What was that milestone, Lex?
400.
We hit 400. Now, we know that we probably have more people that listen on and off than that, but that metric has been pretty reliable because it's a predictor of how many downloads we'll get on an episode over its first 90 days. So we had been climbing towards that after having a little bit of a flattened out period during. I hold that to being the pandemic. People focused on a lot of other things, but it's nice to see that go up. And while that may not seem like a large number, the fact that we know that when we're talking here, there's probably 400 or so of you out there that are listening helps us make when we're focusing on having a conversation, thinking about you when we're doing it. So we just want to say thank you if you're among that 400, or if you're what's making that 401 or 402 or climbing on up from there. We certainly recognize and appreciate that. Anything you want to say before we close, Lex?
I think you covered it.
All right, good deal. So once again, as we always do on A Fork in Time, we encourage you that if you encounter that fork as you're heading down the road of time, we encourage you to take it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.